My wife had just finished university, and now the question of where she should find her first job was hanging in the air. She had never worked before, her parents supported her during her studies, and when we got married, I took over the responsibility. We talked about what to do next, and she asked me how I found my first job. It took me back, and I decided to share my story with her. I told her that my journey to employment wasn't exactly typical. I'd been working in the same company for years, and I got there thanks to a bit of luck and a friend. One day, I wrote an in-depth review of a technical product online. I laid out all the pros and cons as clearly as I could. As it turned out, my friend saw the post and thought it was impressive enough to show his boss. That same friend then suggested I join him at his company, and, surprisingly, they offered me a job after I met with the boss. Sometimes, it's just about being in the right place at the right time. My wife listened intently, and I could see her thinking it over. She smiled and said that maybe there was something to learn from my experience. She mentioned that she would start by putting her resume up on a few job sites, just to see if anything came her way. She also thought about reaching out to her friends and contacts, figuring that someone might know of an opportunity. I agreed that it was a smart idea and told her I'd also ask around my circle to see if anyone knew of any openings. Over the next few days, I did just that. I spoke with some of my friends, asked around at work, and checked if there were any opportunities that might suit her. Unfortunately, nothing really came up. It didn't surprise me much, though. These things take time, and good opportunities don't always just fall into your lap. I knew she would need patience. It's a process, after all. One day, she came home, and I could tell right away that something was different. She had a big smile on her face, the kind that lets you know something good happened before she even says a word. She told me that one of her best friend's acquaintances worked as an HR manager at a company, and, lucky for us, they were looking to fill a position that matched her specialty. I could see that she was excited, and I was genuinely happy for her. She explained that she had already arranged an interview for the next day. The opportunity seemed promising, and I could tell she was proud of taking the initiative. It's not always easy putting yourself out there, but she did it without hesitation, and I admired her for that. As we talked about the upcoming interview, she asked me a few questions: what to expect, how to prepare, and whether there was anything specific she should keep in mind. I gave her a few pointers, told her to stay confident, and reminded her to just be herself. I knew she could handle it, but sometimes, it's just about hearing the right words from someone you trust. Before she went off to get ready for her interview, I told her that if she needed anything, whether it was advice, help preparing, or even just a ride to the company, she should let me know. She nodded, still smiling, and I could see that spark of determination in her eyes. She was ready to face whatever came her way, and I was there to back her up however she needed. The next morning, I woke up to a loud clatter coming from the kitchen. It sounded like a pot had crashed to the floor, and before I could even get out of bed, I could hear my wife running around the house. She was clearly stressed out, talking loudly to herself about how she had no idea what to wear for her interview. I got up, took a moment to gather myself, and walked into the kitchen to see what was going on. She was in a bit of a frenzy, moving between the closet and the kitchen, holding up different outfits, and muttering about how nothing seemed right. It was clear that she was overthinking everything, which wasn't uncommon for big moments like this. I knew I had to step in and help her calm down a bit. That's when an idea struck me, a practical solution that might just make her feel more confident. I told her to call her friend. She looked at me, confused, and asked why. I explained that we were going to do something called an OSINT analysis. She gave me an even more puzzled look, asking what on earth that meant. I smiled and told her it was just a fancy way of saying that we were going to gather some information about her acquaintance, specifically, to find out what kind of style she liked. I figured if we knew her preferences, my wife could dress in a way that would immediately click with her interview. She hesitated for a moment, then agreed to go along with my plan. I took the lead, grabbed her phone, and dialed her friend. When she answered, I asked her about the interview, what her style was like, what kind of perfume she liked, anything that could help us prepare. Her friend was surprisingly helpful, sharing all sorts of details about her acquaintance's preferences. It seemed like she was more than happy to give us some insight. After hanging up, I turned to my wife and told her exactly what to do. I suggested she tie her hair up in a neat bun, wear a light summer dress, specifically the white one she had, and get ready quickly because we had one more stop to make before the interview. She looked at me with wide eyes, clearly surprised by the level of detail I had just provided. Then, she smiled and called me a genius. I just shrugged. I was just trying to help her get the job. Once she was dressed and ready, I told her we needed to head to the store. She gave me a puzzled look, but I explained that we were going to pick up the exact perfume that her friend had mentioned. We drove to the nearest department store, went straight to the fragrance section, and found the scent we needed. I helped her spray just the right amount, not too much, but enough to make an impression. She looked at me, still a bit in awe, and shook her head, calling me brilliant again. After we finished at the store, I drove her to the interview. I wished her good luck before she got out of the car, reminding her that she had everything she needed to succeed. She took a deep breath, smiled at me, and got out of the car, walking towards the building with confidence. I watched her go for a moment, knowing that she was ready, and then I drove back home. Later that evening, I started to wonder why she hadn't returned home yet. I knew interviews could sometimes take a while, but it was getting late, and I was beginning to get a bit curious. Just as I was about to call her, my phone rang. It was her. She sounded excited, almost giddy, and told me to come meet her at the park. She said they were having a great time and that her acquaintance was just amazing. They had so much in common, and they were even talking about more personal topics. I asked her if they had been drinking, and she laughed, admitting that they had celebrated a bit. I figured I might as well head over there. I got up, grabbed my keys, and started getting ready to go meet them at the park. It sounded like they were having a good time, and I wanted to see how everything had gone for her. When I arrived at the park, I parked the car and made my way over to where they were sitting. From a distance, I could already see my wife and her new acquaintance laughing hysterically at something. It seemed like they were really enjoying themselves, and I noticed they had set up a little picnic. It was clear that they were having a good time, which made me feel relieved. I walked over to them, and my wife immediately introduced me to her acquaintance. The moment I approached, her acquaintance looked at me with a playful grin and said, "I bet you can't guess my name." I already knew it from what my wife's friend had told us earlier, so I confidently answered, and she looked genuinely surprised. We all laughed, and that broke the ice right away. It made the conversation flow more easily, and soon we were all chatting comfortably. As the evening went on, the acquaintance, whose name I now knew well, mentioned something unexpected. She said, "I have a terrible habit, and I might as well admit it now. I absolutely love to argue." She laughed as she said it, and I raised an eyebrow, curious. I asked her why she enjoyed it so much, and she explained that it was all about the thrill of competition for her. She said she just liked the challenge, the back and forth, it gave her a rush. She even tried to pull me into one of her little challenges right there and then. She said, "You know, I bet that in the first week at the office, some pudgy IT guy with relationship issues is going to fall head over heels for your wife." The way she said it caught me off guard, and I thought to myself that this was quite an odd thing to bring up. I kept my response straightforward, telling her that if anyone did fall for my wife and tried anything inappropriate, they might end up regretting it. I wasn't about to let anyone disrespect her. She rolled her eyes playfully and said she was just joking, that she thought I was strong enough to handle it. She then went on about how the guy she was referring to had been working at the office forever and was known for being a bit of a snitch, always running to management with whatever plans they had. She laughed it off, mentioning that she liked to keep things lively at work, and I started to get a clearer picture of her personality. She seemed like someone who enjoyed stirring things up, which made me think that she might not be the most stable influence. We ended up staying there for quite a while. They continued talking about all sorts of things, mostly about the workplace, people they knew, and the office culture. The acquaintance seemed to have plenty of stories about the office, most of them involving some kind of drama or trouble. My wife listened with interest, clearly entertained by it all, while I sat back and took it all in. I wasn't entirely sure how I felt about this person yet, but it was clear that my wife was enjoying herself, and that was what mattered at the moment. Eventually, it started getting late. My wife was visibly tired, and her speech was beginning to slur a bit. I decided it was time for us to head home. I stood up and offered my hand to help her up. She thanked the acquaintance for the company and the conversation, and I nodded politely in agreement. Despite my reservations about some of the things that had been said, it had been a decent enough evening overall. As we were getting ready to leave, the acquaintance waved enthusiastically and called out, "Don't forget, we're expecting you at work on Monday." She seemed genuinely excited for my wife to start, which was at least a positive sign. My wife smiled, clearly pleased, and I gave a quick nod before we finally made our way back to the car. It had been an interesting night, to say the least, and I hoped that whatever came next would be just as positive for her. We said our goodbyes, and the acquaintance continued to shout after us, reminding my wife that they were looking forward to seeing her at work on Monday. My wife waved back, and I helped her into the car, ready to head home after a long and somewhat surprising day. Once we got home, I helped my wife to bed since she was clearly exhausted from the long day. After making sure she was comfortable, I went to the living room, grabbed my phone, and called a few friends to talk about what had happened at the park. They were curious about the whole situation, especially about the new acquaintance. When I mentioned how lively she was and how much she liked to argue, one of my friends laughed and said, "Man, I wish I had a coworker like that. Sounds like she keeps things interesting." I couldn't help but share my own thoughts, though. I told them that I found her to be a bit too much, honestly. She seemed to be really into partying, and her attitude about work wasn't exactly what I would call professional. One of my friends, who had been through a tough divorce, chimed in and said I should keep an eye on things. He explained that a lot depends on the people you surround yourself with, and sometimes the wrong company can lead to bad decisions. I listened to what he had to say and nodded along. He was probably right, and it was something worth keeping in mind. After chatting with them for a while longer, I decided to call it a night. I went to bed, my mind still mulling over what my friends had said. It wasn't that I didn't trust my wife, I absolutely did. But I knew that people can be influenced by those around them, and her new acquaintance seemed like someone who could easily drag others into her chaotic lifestyle. Still, I didn't want to overthink it too much. I closed my eyes and drifted off to sleep, hoping for the best. The next morning, I woke up before my wife and decided to make her some coffee. I knew she might have a bit of a headache from the previous night, and I wanted her to have a good start to the day. Once the coffee was ready, I brought it to her and asked her how the interview had gone. She smiled and told me that the acquaintance immediately complimented her perfume and her appearance. She said that, honestly, they didn't even discuss work much. Instead, they just chatted away, and before she knew it, the interview had turned into a casual conversation. I nodded and told her that it was great, she had made a good impression. Still, I couldn't help but mention that I found it a bit strange how much the acquaintance loved to argue, and how she seemed so eager to talk badly about others. Specifically, the way she talked about that guy from the office had rubbed me the wrong way. I reminded her about what my friend had said, how the people you spend time with can influence your behavior. I didn't want her to get caught up in anything that might lead to trouble. My wife listened patiently, but I could tell she didn't share my concerns. She said that, on the contrary, she found the acquaintance's outgoing nature to be refreshing. She explained that just because someone liked to party or have fun didn't mean they were a bad person. There were plenty of reasons why someone might cheat or make bad choices, but that didn't mean everyone who enjoyed themselves was like that. She assured me that she would never excuse someone for betraying their spouse, but she also didn't see any harm in spending time with someone who was a bit more adventurous. She then mentioned that she had already made plans to meet up with the acquaintance for coffee that day. It was Saturday, after all, and it seemed like a good chance for her to learn more about the role and her future responsibilities. She seemed genuinely excited about it, and I could tell she was eager to make a good impression at her new job. I hesitated for a moment, then told her that I still wasn't sure about this person. I suggested that she be careful, as I had a feeling that the acquaintance could potentially get her into some sort of trouble. My wife gave me a puzzled look, clearly not understanding why I was so concerned. She called me strange and reassured me that nothing bad was going to happen. She was confident that she could handle herself, and she didn't see any reason to worry. With that, she finished her coffee, got up, and left the house to go meet her new acquaintance. When my wife came back from her coffee meeting, she was beaming with excitement. She told me that it had gone incredibly well and that the acquaintance had given her a lot of helpful insights about how things would work at the company. She also mentioned, almost casually, that the acquaintance was actually dating one of the company's senior managers. It seemed that this connection had played a big part in helping her land the job. She reassured me that the responsibilities were nothing she couldn't handle and that it sounded like it would be a perfect fit for her. Later that night, as we were getting ready for bed, she told me more about her conversation. Apparently, the acquaintance had really gone out of her way to make my wife feel welcome, and they had talked about everything from office culture to the types of tasks she'd be handling. She seemed confident that it was going to be smooth sailing and that the job would be easy for her. Afterward, we both decided to call it a night, and I hoped that everything would go as well as she anticipated. After her first day at work, she came home absolutely thrilled. She told me that her new colleagues were fantastic and she was already getting along well with everyone. She was especially happy to be in the same department as her acquaintance. They had quickly become close, which seemed to make my wife even more comfortable in her new role. She also mentioned that her acquaintance had organized a company event for the new hires and that it was going to be held in her honor. She seemed genuinely excited about it, which made me happy for her. She also told me that there were some secret traditions among the employees, things that they did to bond and build team spirit. I could tell that she was feeling welcomed and that she was fitting in well. It seemed like everything was off to a great start, and I was relieved to see her so enthusiastic about her new job. The excitement carried on over the next few days, and she spoke a lot about the fun activities and the overall camaraderie at the office. It was clear that she was enjoying herself, and that was all that mattered to me at the time. Eventually, the day of the company event arrived. That night, she came home very drunk. I wasn't particularly surprised. I knew that company parties could sometimes get out of hand, and I'd been to my share of events where people let loose a bit too much. She was cheerful, albeit a bit unsteady, and I helped her get to bed without saying much about it. I figured it was a one-time thing, and she would be back to her usual self the next day. But as the days turned into weeks, the parties and late nights started to become more frequent. It wasn't just the company event anymore, there were more and more get-togethers, and my wife began coming home late more often. It became almost routine. She would come in late, sometimes a little tipsy, and I would just try to brush it off. But after about a month of this, it was starting to wear on me. She seemed to have forgotten about the rest of our friends, spending almost all of her free time with her acquaintance and her co-workers. It felt like everything else had taken a back seat to her new social circle. One night, she came home late yet again, and I decided I had finally had enough. I told her that I was tired of this. She had been coming home late for weeks, and it seemed like she had completely abandoned her old friends. I tried to make her understand that I was worried about her, that this wasn't the kind of behavior I was used to from her. I told her that I didn't want her spending so much time with her acquaintance anymore, and I suggested that she take a step back from all the partying and late nights. My words didn't go over well. She immediately became defensive, and it quickly escalated into a full-blown argument. She accused me of being controlling and unreasonable, and I tried to explain that I was only looking out for her. But neither of us was really listening to the other. We were both too caught up in our own frustrations. The argument got louder, and soon we were both saying things that were more personal than they should have been. It was one of those fights where you cross lines you never intended to. Eventually, we both reached a point where we were just too exhausted to keep going. The shouting subsided, and there was nothing left to say. We both went to bed, still upset and without any real resolution. The next morning, we were both abruptly woken up by the sound of my wife's phone ringing. It was loud, persistent, and impossible to ignore. I glanced at the screen before she could get to it, and I saw that it was her acquaintance calling. My wife grabbed the phone, and as soon as she answered, I heard a shrill voice on the other end. Her acquaintance was crying, practically screaming into the phone about how her boyfriend, the senior manager, had broken up with her. She was furious and heartbroken, ranting about how all men were the same. My wife listened for a moment, then told her that she would come over right away. She hung up, turned to me, and gave me an apologetic look. While making herself a quick cup of coffee, she told me that she was really sorry for how things had been lately. She promised that she would start spending more time with me, but right now, her friend was in a bad place and needed her support. I didn't say much in response, I just nodded and watched as she got ready to leave. She left the house, promising to be back later in the evening. I couldn't help but feel a bit uneasy about it all, but I knew that there was nothing I could do to stop her. She wanted to be there for her friend, and I could understand that. Still, I hoped that this wouldn't become yet another excuse for more late nights and more of the same behavior we had been dealing with lately. That evening, my wife finally returned home. She was clearly a little tipsy, and I could tell that the day had taken a toll on her. She sat down and started telling me about how long it had taken to calm her friend down. She seemed tired but still had that spark in her eyes that said she wasn't quite ready to call it a night. She mentioned that, at some point, they had ended up making another bet. I immediately asked her if this was the same secret bet she had talked about before. She shook her head and said that this was a different one. I asked her what it was about, and she hesitated, mumbling her response. Eventually, she explained that the bet was about proving themselves as strong and independent women. Her friend was determined to show everyone that she didn't need her ex, and now they had made a pact to do whatever it took to outshine the other teams at work. If their department, which was mostly women, could beat the productivity record of another department by the end of the month, her friend would supposedly never go back to that guy. If not, she would apologize and try to make amends with him. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. I asked her if she seriously thought this was a good idea. To me, it sounded ridiculous. Why would anyone make their personal relationships dependent on office productivity? My wife, though, was adamant. She said her friend was just really angry with men and wanted to prove a point. She wanted to show that she was better off without him, and my wife seemed determined to help her do that. I shook my head, trying to wrap my mind around the situation. I told her bluntly that it all seemed pretty stupid to me. Making a bet like that, especially one involving work and personal relationships, just seemed like a recipe for disaster. She looked at me with frustration and defended her friend, insisting that she was just doing what she needed to do to move on. I could tell she wasn't going to change her mind about it, no matter what I said. The argument didn't go much further. She defended her friend, making it clear that she was going to stand by her, no matter how irrational I thought it all was. I realized that pushing the issue any further would only lead to more fighting, so I let it go. The tension slowly eased, and we both decided to move on from the topic. Eventually, we shifted to lighter conversation, and soon enough, we were getting ready for bed, both too tired to keep going with anything else. After that moment, things started to get even stranger. My wife began mentioning her acquaintance less and less. The stories about what was happening at work, the constant talk of office parties and gossip, all of it seemed to die down. It was almost as if the excitement had suddenly vanished. The house felt quieter, and the once lively recounts of her days had turned into simple, vague updates. I asked her about it one evening, wondering what had changed. She just shrugged and said that the mood at work wasn't the same anymore. The parties had slowed down, and everything had settled into a more stable routine. She sounded convincing, and I wanted to believe her, but there was still something that didn't sit right with me. Although the corporate events had apparently stopped, she still came home late from time to time. It wasn't as frequent as before, but it was still happening, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something was going on. I tried not to let my thoughts run wild, but a part of me just couldn't ignore the nagging sense that things were being hidden from me. One night, after yet another late return, I decided that I needed to get some answers. I waited until she had fallen asleep, and then I quietly went to where she kept her phone. I picked it up, but to my frustration, I found that there was now a password on it. It wasn't something she had done before, and it only made my suspicions grow. Why would she suddenly put a password on her phone if there was nothing to hide? I knew I needed to find a way to unlock it. I thought about it for a while and then remembered my friend who worked with phone repairs. People often came to him when they forgot their passwords or needed to unlock a phone for some other reason. I knew that, occasionally, his clients might have questionable reasons for needing help, like buying a stolen phone. But that wasn't my concern at the moment. I needed to find out what was on my wife's phone, and he was the only one I knew who could help. The next day, I decided to put my plan into motion. That evening, after dinner, I made sure her phone was charging in the living room. When we went to bed, she forgot it there, just as I had hoped. Once I was sure she was asleep, I quietly got up, went to the living room, and took the phone. I went down to the garage with it, grabbed a hammer, and gave the phone a light but deliberate hit, just enough to crack the screen without causing too much damage. Then, I turned it off and put it away. In the morning, I told her that I had heard some strange noise during the night. I said that I went to check it out, and in the process, I had accidentally knocked her phone off the table, causing it to break. She was understandably upset, but I quickly reassured her by suggesting that we go out right away to get her a new phone. I even insisted on covering the cost, which seemed to brighten her mood a bit. She agreed, and we got ready to head out. We went to the store, and I bought her a brand new phone. She seemed happy enough, and once we got home, she started setting it up while I made an excuse to leave for a bit. I told her that I needed to go to the gas station and take the car in for some maintenance. She didn't question it, and I could see she was preoccupied with her new device anyway. I put her broken phone in my bag, making sure it was well hidden, and left the house. As I drove off, I knew exactly where I was going. I was planning to head straight to my friend who did phone repairs. I needed him to help me unlock her old phone. I didn't know what I was going to find, but I felt like I had to know the truth, no matter what it might be. When I arrived at my friend's shop, I wasted no time explaining the entire situation to him. I told him about the password on my wife's phone, my suspicions, and my need to find out the truth. He listened without much reaction, nodding along as I spoke. He didn't seem too surprised. After all, he dealt with people trying to unlock phones for all sorts of reasons. Once I finished, he took the phone from me, looked at the cracked screen, and then nodded. He didn't hesitate, he grabbed a cable and connected the phone to his computer. He opened up a program called John the Ripper. I asked him what it was, and he briefly explained that it was software designed to crack passwords. He told me that it would help bypass the limit on password attempts and brute force the code until it was unlocked. It sounded a bit extreme, but I was too deep in this to care. I needed answers, and I didn't have the luxury of worrying about the methods. So, we sat there, waiting as the program worked through every possible combination. It took about 30 minutes of watching numbers and letters scroll across the screen before we finally saw what we were looking for. The phone was unlocked. My heart was pounding as he handed it back to me. I took a deep breath and immediately started looking through her messages. The first thing I checked was her work chat, which was set to silent. That seemed odd in itself, so I opened it up and started scrolling through the conversation history. It didn't take long for me to come across something that made my stomach drop. There were messages between her co-workers referring to the black hole. At first, I thought it was some sort of inside joke, maybe something about a project or a team name. But as I read further, I realized it was a nickname they had given to my wife. They were talking about her, and the things they said were far from innocent. I kept reading, feeling a mix of confusion, anger, and disbelief. One of the messages talked about her smuggling champagne into an office party inside herself. I didn't want to believe what I was reading, but it was there, clear as day. Another message talked about how she had put on some kind of show during another event, involving the largest item in the office. The words were crude, and the more I read, the sicker I felt. She put this item inside herself. Then, the last string of messages hit me like a brick. During the last company event, she had apparently cheated on me with 6 different men. I couldn't even begin to process it. I just kept staring at the screen, hoping that somehow I was misunderstanding everything. I kept scrolling, feeling numb, until I saw her acquaintance's nickname in the group. They called her Big Hole. The realization hit me that her friend wasn't much different from my wife. They were both involved in whatever this twisted game was. I decided to switch over to the private chat between my wife and her acquaintance. I needed to know what else was going on. As soon as I opened it, I saw something that made my blood boil. There was a counter in their conversation, 23 for my wife, 21 for her friend. It was a count of how many men they had each slept with. Suddenly, it all made sense. The bet they had talked about after that emotional morning, it wasn't about productivity or office success. It was about seeing who could sleep with more men. The whole thing was a lie. Her acquaintance hadn't even broken up with her boyfriend, they had just argued. Everything I thought I knew had been a facade, and I felt an overwhelming mix of betrayal, anger, and disgust. I wanted to confront her right then and there, but I knew I needed a plan. I kept digging through her phone, trying to find anything else that might help me understand the full scope of what was going on. That's when I found a contact labeled work nuisance. It seemed out of place, and I was curious, so I decided to call the number. When the person answered, I quickly introduced myself and explained the situation. I told him that I needed his help getting the messages I had found to the company leadership anonymously. To my surprise, he was more than willing to help. He said he was fed up with the drama and that he would gladly do anything to put an end to it. I thanked him and told him I owed him one. He laughed it off, saying that he'd be happy with a beer sometime. I hung up the phone, feeling a strange sense of both dread and relief. I wasn't sure what the fallout from all this would be, but I knew I had to take action. I couldn't let this continue, and I needed to do what was right, not just for me, but for everyone else involved. I took a deep breath, pulled out my own phone, and started taking pictures of the incriminating conversations. Once I had everything documented, I tucked her phone back into my bag and got ready to head back home. When I got home that day, I acted like nothing was out of the ordinary. I didn't want to give anything away. I needed time to think, and I didn't want my wife to suspect anything before I was ready to take action. I knew I needed legal advice, so I messaged my friend and asked him for the contact information of the lawyer he had used during his divorce. He responded quickly, giving me the lawyer's number, and I saved it for the moment when I would need it. I knew that soon everything would come to light, and I needed to be prepared. The next morning, I was woken up by the sound of my wife screaming. I rushed out of the bedroom, pretending to be concerned, and found her standing in the living room, holding her phone with tears streaming down her face. She looked at me, her face flushed with anger and shock, and yelled that she had been fired. Apparently, she had received a call from her manager, informing her that she was being let go due to inappropriate behavior. Someone had gone to the company leadership with information about her actions, and it had all come crashing down. She was in hysterics, shouting about how someone had set her up, how some snake had gone behind her back and lied to her boss. She kept repeating that none of it was true, that it was all a bunch of lies meant to ruin her. I stood there, watching her unravel, and I couldn't help but feel a grim sense of satisfaction. After everything I had read, after all the betrayal and lies, it felt like she was finally facing the consequences of her actions. I waited for a moment, letting her vent, before I calmly asked, "Is it not true?" She looked at me, stunned, as if she couldn't believe what I had just said. Her face twisted with rage, and she screamed at me, asking how I could even think that. How could I question her like that? That was when I decided to drop the act. I looked her in the eyes and told her that I knew everything. I told her that I had seen the messages, that I knew what she had been doing at work, and that I was the one who had sent the evidence to her boss. For a moment, there was complete silence. Then, she erupted. She screamed at me, her face red with fury, demanding to know why I would do something like that. She called me every name in the book, accusing me of ruining her life, of destroying everything for no reason. But I stayed calm. I told her that she had brought this on herself, that she was the one who had betrayed me, who had lied and cheated. I told her that she deserved every bit of what was happening to her. There was no remorse in my voice, I meant every word. She tried to argue, to defend herself, but there was nothing she could say that would change what I had seen. The evidence was right there, in black and white, and no amount of screaming or crying was going to make me forget it. I turned away from her, walked to the bedroom, and started pulling her things out of the closet. I could hear her behind me, still yelling, but her words were starting to blur together. I was done listening to her excuses. I grabbed a suitcase from under the bed and started throwing her clothes into it. She followed me into the room, trying to stop me, but I pushed past her. I told her that she had to leave, that there was no place for her here anymore. She had made her choices, and now she had to live with the consequences. She tried to plead with me, her voice breaking, but I didn't waver. I had made up my mind, and there was no going back. Once I had packed up most of her things, I dragged the suitcase to the front door and opened it. I could feel her eyes on me, filled with a mix of anger and desperation, but I didn't look at her. I opened the door and tossed the suitcase out onto the front step. Then, I turned back to her and told her to get out. She stood there for a moment, as if she couldn't believe what was happening, but I didn't give her a chance to argue. I walked over to her, grabbed her arm, and led her to the door. She stumbled out onto the porch, still shouting at me, but I didn't respond. I picked up the rest of her things, threw them out after her, and then slammed the door shut. I locked it, stood there for a moment, and took a deep breath. It was over. She was gone. I knew there was still a long road ahead, the divorce, dealing with the aftermath, but for now, I had done what I needed to do. I had taken the first step towards moving on. After I had thrown her out, I spent some time walking through the house. It was eerily quiet, and I felt the emptiness of it all settling in. But I wasn't about to let my guard down. I knew that there might still. Even if she managed to break in, the last place she'd go was the cluttered, dusty space where I kept my tools and old equipment. Once I had hidden away her valuables, I turned my attention to my own finances. I couldn't afford to take any chances. I logged into my accounts and began transferring my money to my best friend's account. I trusted him, and I knew he would keep the funds safe for me. I sent him a message, letting him know what I had done, and asked him not to touch the money. I explained that it was my emergency stash, and that I was in the middle of a divorce. He understood and assured me that the money would be safe with him. I knew that the coming days would be difficult. I had seen enough people go through divorces to know that they could be messy, drawn-out affairs. I was preparing myself for whatever might come, and I knew that protecting my assets was the first step. My wife had already shown that she was willing to cross lines, and I had no doubt that she would come back for more if she thought she could get something out of it. I was determined not to let that happen. Later that night, I was sitting in the living room, trying to unwind, when I heard a loud crash. My heart skipped a beat, and I immediately knew what had happened. I got up and walked towards the sound, and as I approached the front of the house, I saw that one of the windows had been shattered. My wife was there, trying to climb through the broken window. She was desperate, her face twisted with rage, her hands shaking as she tried to pull herself inside. I stood there for a moment, watching her struggle. She looked up and saw me, her eyes filled with a mix of anger and desperation. She yelled at me, demanding to be let back inside. She was looking for her money, her jewelry, anything she could get her hands on. But I wasn't about to let her back in. I told her, firmly and calmly, that there was no place for her here anymore. I had made my decision, and nothing she said or did was going to change that. She continued to yell, her voice growing louder and more frantic. She was completely out of control, shouting obscenities, accusing me of stealing from her, calling me every name she could think of. But I stayed calm. I knew that getting angry wouldn't solve anything, and I wasn't going to give her the satisfaction of seeing me lose my composure. I simply stood there, watching her, waiting for her to tire herself out. It became clear that she wasn't going to stop. Her screaming was getting louder, and I knew that the neighbors would soon be concerned. I couldn't let this go on any longer. I pulled out my phone and dialed the police. When the operator answered, I explained the situation. My ex-wife had broken a window, was trying to force her way into my home, and was completely out of control. They assured me that an officer would be dispatched immediately. A few minutes later, the police arrived. They found her still standing at the broken window, still yelling, still trying to force her way inside. The officers approached her, speaking to her calmly, trying to de-escalate the situation. But she was beyond reason. She kept yelling, even as they tried to calm her down. Eventually, they had no choice but to take her into custody. They led her away, still screaming, her voice echoing down the street. I watched as they put her in the back of the patrol car. I stayed calm, feeling a strange sense of finality. It was over. She was gone, and I could finally begin to move on with my life. After some time, I managed to successfully finalize the divorce. The court ruled in my favor, allowing me to keep my savings and protect my assets. It was a relief, a weight lifted off my shoulders. I felt a sense of closure, knowing that this chapter of my life was finally coming to an end. After everything that had happened, I knew I needed a break, some time to clear my head and figure out what to do next. I decided to take a week off and move back in with my parents for a while. I explained everything to them, and they welcomed me with open arms, offering me the support I needed. While staying with my parents, I took the opportunity to finalize my finances. I reached out to my friend, who had been holding my emergency funds, and transferred the money back into my account. With that settled, I started thinking about my next steps. I wanted a fresh start, a new place that wouldn't hold any memories of my previous life. I made the decision to sell the old house and look for a new one. It took some time, but eventually, I found the perfect place, a house that felt like it could be my new sanctuary. After selling the old house and moving into my new home, I felt a sense of freedom that I hadn't experienced in a long time. To celebrate the fresh start, I decided to throw a small party with some of my closest friends. It was a way to mark the end of one chapter and the beginning of another. We laughed, shared stories, and enjoyed each other's company. It felt good to be surrounded by people who genuinely cared about me. For the first time in a while, I felt like I could finally breathe again. A few days after the party, I was settling into my new routine when I heard an unexpected knock at the door. I wasn't expecting anyone, so I hesitated for a moment before going to answer it. When I opened the door, I was shocked to see my ex-wife standing there, along with her friend and the acquaintance who had been part of all the chaos. Without waiting for an invitation, they barged into my house, their expressions filled with anger and determination. They started rummaging through my things, opening cabinets and searching for something. I stood there for a moment, taken aback by their audacity. They were shouting at me, calling me names, accusing me of being a terrible person for kicking my ex-wife out. They claimed that I should have just accepted everything that had happened, that I should have been willing to wait for her while she enjoyed herself with other men. Their words were filled with venom, and it was clear that they had no intention of leaving peacefully. I took a deep breath, trying to stay calm. I told them, firmly, that they needed to leave. I warned them that if they didn't, I would have no choice but to call the police. My ex-wife, fueled by anger, tried to push past me, her hand raised as if she was about to strike me. I reacted instinctively, grabbing her arm and twisting it behind her back, holding her in place. Her friend stood there, stunned, not sure what to do. I told them once again that they needed to leave, but they just stood there, too shocked to move. I knew that the situation was getting out of hand, and I needed to put an end to it before it escalated any further. I pulled out my phone and called the police, explaining the situation as calmly as I could. Within a few minutes, I heard the sound of sirens approaching. The officers arrived, and they quickly assessed the situation. My ex-wife was still struggling in my grip, and her friends were shouting, trying to make excuses for their actions. But the officers weren't interested in hearing their side of the story, they were here to restore order. The police took control, separating us and questioning everyone involved. It didn't take long for them to realize that my ex-wife and her friends were trespassing and causing a disturbance. The officers decided to take them into custody, leading them out of my house one by one. My ex-wife continued to shout, her voice filled with anger, but I just stood there, watching as they were escorted out. The officers assured me that they would handle the situation, and I thanked them for their help. Later on, I learned that my ex-wife and her friends were forced to pay a significant amount in damages and compensation for their actions that day. I could have pressed charges and taken things further, but I decided not to. I didn't want to drag this out any longer than it needed to be. Instead, I agreed to a financial settlement, and with that, I was finally able to put an end to this whole ordeal. The compensation was more than enough to cover the damages, and I was finally able to move on with my life, free from the chaos that had consumed it for so long.